Hi there, I'm Kate. This is a quick video on cycle tracking. There's so much to know about this, and I go a lot more in depth in my program, but I'm going to give you just a portion of a lesson because when you have PCOS, one of the biggest frustrations is just not knowing whether you're ovulating and, to time it so that you go in and get an ultrasound and see ovulation is basically impossible. And especially if you're irregular, and then if you're trying to conceive and you're trying to time sex based on ovulation test strips, this is one reason why, that method fails you and leaves you frustrated, because you can get a lot of positive ovulation results and not actually be ovulating, because LH, luteinizing hormone, is a hormone that precedes ovulation and is typically high in women with PCOS. So, with that little mini lesson in mind, I'm going to talk about this mini lesson, which is understanding your fertility signs and learning how to track them accurately so that when you do begin ovulating regularly again and your hormones get into better balance, you'll be able to pinpoint it and time intercourse and get pregnant better, and just overall get a lot more data on what's going on. So, key fertility signs. Okay. So, we can actually observe whether we're ovulating or not um, at home fairly cheaply. You can purchase a $12 thermometer to just leave on your nightstand, and every morning prior to getting up and peeing or taking a drink or sitting up, doing anything, basically, just take your temperature. This is your basal body temperature. It's like when you're completely at rest. So, um, you need to have been sleeping, at least 3 hours prior to this. You should be sleeping lots more than that every night, but I digress. Um, when we take these temperatures and chart them, we can see a shift based on the hormone progesterone. So, listen into my podcasts, try to understand ovulation, and the key benefit of ovulation is the surge in the hormone progesterone in our body. And we can measure that quantitatively through checking our temperature. If you think about incubating eggs, right? We got to keep those eggs warm. Same thing happens inside our body. When there's a chance of conception, our body raises the temperature to protect that fetus. And, whether or not there is actually a fetus or not. So it doesn't mean that you're pregnant. It just means now's the time where we're really care to take care of that potential fetus, right? If you see here, your temperature isn't going to be exactly the same every single day, but it's going to vary, within 3 to 5 points most days prior to ovulation. And then what happens is when you ovulate, you will see a big jump. Sometimes, I'm going to show you a few different charts here, but sometimes it's a slow climb, but you'll see that it rises above the average. So this was the highest temperature of those, 2 weeks preceding. But basically the rule is just the last 5 temperatures. Once you jump, I may be getting ahead of myself, but once we see a jump, I think it's 0.4 points above all of those, and then it stays up high, that is an indication of ovulation, okay? So progesterone warms the body in a measurable way. That's our first fertility sign. A second at-home observable fertility sign is cervical mucus. So if you have PCOS, sometimes this can be tricky because you can have that fertile quality cervical mucus all the time because you've got that elevated LH. However, I still want you to practice tracking it, paying attention to it as it eventually changes. So it's normal and expected that the feeling in your underwear or when you wipe or what you see on the toilet paper will change throughout your cycle, or it should. It goes from kind of either totally dry to sticky, gummy, creamy, and then egg white, like stretchy and thin and watery, sort of. Um, when we If you look at this chart, again, this person is charting, here's her period, and then her cervical mucus is sort of changing, getting a little bit more fertile, but then this green is indicating like this is the most, it's very stretchy, very goobery, we're noticing that. And then pretty soon after ovulation, you'll notice that it just dries up until your next period. Okay, so if you can track that, and your cycles begin to get more regular, then you can see that, oh, this is actually preceding ovulation. This is the right time to time sex if I want to get pregnant. Or in the future, avoid sex when you're not ready to get pregnant. Avoid unprotected sex. That's what I should say. So that's fertility sign number 2. And when we line those up, we can get a pretty great idea of actual confirmed ovulation and even pregnancy without having to pee on LH sticks or even pee on a pregnancy test, which I know is very triggering and unhappy until it is happy, right? The third is more of an optional thing. You don't need to be checking this, but it's just interesting to know that the position of your cervix, which is the opening of your uterus, moves both up and down in position and also in quality. It's a little softer and more open when you're fertile, and it's more firm and closed when you're not fertile. So you can check this, wash your hands. And, I like to check it in the shower because then it's easy to just wash my hands. I'm in a private space and, kind of take note of that. But I'm not going to get too far into that specifically um, for this training. So, as I was starting to say, take your temperature first thing. For the most accuracy, holding the thermometer under your tongue for 5 minutes before turning it on. If you have that extra time, I highly recommend you do it and just be consistent. Um, have this thermometer be the same one every day. You don't use different thermometers. You don't share that thermometer with other people in the family. You're This is just for you, and you're taking it about the same time, with not a lot of variability. Even if you like to sleep in on the weekends, maybe you try to wake up at about the same time, take your temperature, and then you can just lay back down or, stay in bed for however long you want and chart that temperature later. And then it's important to chart your data points. So this, I think, is called Ovograph. This is what I used for a long time. I don't think this is my cycle. I just have lots of examples. Um, and that's about a 31 day, 32 or 3 day cycle. So yeah. Um, Charting your data points at first, it may be confusing. You may be like studying them over and over. You notice like on this person's period, their temperatures were a little higher. But then they go back down to kind of this average low, and then they stay up high until the next cycle. Then they drop back down, and you'll see a bleed or not. You'll see a pregnancy test, right? A positive pregnancy test. But these are just the basic rules of measuring your basal body temperature. A great book to dive really deep into this is called Taking Charge of Your Own Fertility, and highly recommend that book. You can even find it in your library. You can find an older edition for very cheap online or at like a used bookstore, or you can buy it new. It's like the Bible of fertility tracking. You can start this tomorrow, however. Okay. So I wanted to show, and in this slide, I'm showing how, maybe you've seen this chart before of how our hormones, fluctuate throughout the cycle. So you'll see this red line, our progesterone is pretty low. And then after ovulation, it jumps up and then it has a kind of gradual descent until it drops off entirely, triggering a bleed. That descent happens when there's no uh, pregnancy. If you are pregnant, your progesterone will stay up high and you'll see, you'll reach past 18 days. You'll get to like day 17 and your temperature is still up above this cover line. And then you'll know just based on your temperature that you're pregnant. And then you can take a pregnancy test. Some people like to not give themselves the stress of all those negative pregnancy tests by just watching their temperature and not taking a test until they're really pretty sure that they should be having their period by now. Obviously, you didn't get your period, but for someone with PCOS, that can be tricky because you're used to not getting your period. Um, the cover line is, certain apps will learn your patterns and they'll notice this pattern. They have kind of an algorithm of, oh, look, you had lots of days with low temperatures and then it jumped up and stayed up high. And so it starts to count down, to about 15 days when you should be expecting your period. And it will draw this line just as kind of a visual help to you. The ovulation line is, that last temperature before the spike up. So these are pretty clear examples where there's a clear low and then a clear high. Not every chart will be the same or have the same exact jump. Yours might be a little bit more gradual, but it's kind of nice to see it when they have the obvious jump up and then down. Here are some examples of anovulatory or PCOS cycles. So you see these green patches represent that cervical, that egg white cervical mucus, which can be kind of tricky and frustrating because, oh, I had a patch here, I had a patch here, I had a patch here. But none of it really meant ovulation. In this cycle, long cycle with no ovulation, and then eventually sometimes you can have a bleed that's just, you've been building up this lining and eventually the dam breaks and you have to have a bleed. Doesn't necessarily mean that you ovulated. That's why charting is so nice because some women with PCOS are actually having a pretty regular bleed, like every 30 days, but they don't realize that they're not actually ovulating. Their body is just sort of in that rhythm of letting go. This cycle over here was a very long cycle. Let's see how long it's hard to see how many days that was. It looks like day 50 something, where they actually had a big patch of cervical mucus, and then they did have a rise that mostly stayed elevated. And then it was a short luteal phase. Oh, I have it written right here. Multiple attempts before finally ovulating on day 53. So when you see a cycle like this, where, you're really kind of staying consistently down there, then you can see that ovulation is not happening until it does. And that can be very frustrating. So how much more do I want to share in this? Why is this important? Things that can affect your basal body temperature. This is important to know. If you're sleeping at lots of random times, waking up lots of random times, that chart may not reflect really what your true basal body temperature is. If you have an illness or a fever, obviously that can elevate your temperature and you want to exclude that from kind of the data set when you're looking at it. And a lot of apps usually have that option to just say exclude this temperature, it's questionable. not getting enough sleep. So if you're really only getting 3 hours of sleep a night, or on a certain night, that can affect it. And drinking alcohol the night before, which if you're trying to conceive, I recommend that you cut that out. That can also raise your basal body temperature. So if you've been drinking the night before, then, you know, probably wise to exclude that. Um, we talked about cervical position, timing it right. Yep. All right. So one more thing that I will say prior to logging off here. I'll say a few things. Why is this important if I'm not ovulating regularly already? If I haven't had a period in 6 months? This is a practice that I think will pay you back for the rest of your life, right? It's vital that we understand our bodies, what's going on under the surface, and not always relying on, some kind of ultrasound, or blood tests. I mean, that gets very expensive very quickly, but we can get information on how much progesterone we have, just knowing how long our luteal phase really is when we pinpoint ovulation. It can help us control for getting pregnant when we want to and avoiding pregnancy when we don't want to get pregnant without birth control, further manipulating our hormones. So I recommend that you start this, whether you fully understand it or not. Uh, it's a great way to just start getting data on your own body, and pieces will fall together as you move forward. And obviously, if you're interested in working with me, reach out, leave me a comment, send me an email. The one more thing I was going to say is making this just a little bit easier, especially if you have very irregular sleep schedules and you can't really control that. Um, the Tempdrop is something that I adopted last year rather than just doing the oral temperature taking. It's just an armband. It's downstairs in my room, but it's just an armband. All I have to do is turn it on and put it on my arm before I fall asleep. And it tracks, it gives me a reading. In the morning, I don't have to do anything. I don't have to stay in bed and, take my temperature. I just simply take it off. And later in the day, sometime when I think about it, I sync it to my phone, or maybe in a couple days because it can store for a few days, um, and just charts it for me. And, over time, it will start to learn. One thing I've noticed about it is that it says fertile window for a really long time, just like before you can show that you've ovulated, it says that for a long time. So that's an annoying thing for me. Like if you want to get pregnant and you're like, oh, I'm in my fertile window, it's still learning some things. However, I think it's a great option, especially if everything I just explained sounds overwhelming. All you have to do is put something on, fall asleep, and it doesn't matter if you get some interruptions at night or if you wake up at different times in the morning, you have an accurate reading of what it was while you were totally at rest, asleep. So I will leave that link in the, I'm new to this YouTube thing. I'll leave the link below if you want to check that out with my discount code. Whether you do it or not, it's just an option. So please leave comments with your questions or if this was helpful to you, or again, send me an email. I respond to everyone. Talk to you later.